It's been a while since we've done a session of a guided tour through the FHIR spec, and I wanted to spend just a few minutes today talking through the FHIR clinical safety checklist. And this is one of the most important pages of the FHIR specification that gets a lot less attention than it deserves. So I wanted to use this session first off just to highlight the existence of the clinical safety page and to give you a very quick tour through maybe just one or two topics from the page. But anybody who's implementing FHIR in a real-world production system really owes it to themselves to take a look through this page top to bottom and ask questions. And especially if you've got questions based on your experience reading, we can do follow-up sessions in this guided tour series to dig in on particular topics. But the idea here is there's a whole set of items that implementers should be aware of as they're putting a FHIR specification into production use. And it deals with requirements for managing data in systems, the way that systems talk to each other, and it's a checklist that you can see has, on the order of 50 different specific items that you can review, and I suppose in the UI you can even check them off, which is a feature that I just learned about 1 moment ago as I tried to click. So I want to give you a sense of how much there is here by starting off with a couple of topics. I won't go into the life cycle today, but life cycle deals with resources that can change state over time for things like the status to indicate whether a particular resource is in a draft status or whether it's in a long-term status, or even things where there's a problem with a resource. Maybe it's assigned to the wrong patient, or there was somebody who was typing data into the system by hand and made an error. So a resource might have a status indicating that it was entered in error. And this is one of the first things you want to understand as you're digging into FHIR is how those life cycle kinds of statuses work and how you can detect them and correctly represent them in your own data. And there's a whole page that deals with these kinds of life cycle expectations that we won't review today, but I'll point it out briefly. Where I did want to spend just a few minutes today was talking about modifier elements and modifier extensions in FHIR. And this is a topic that, as you can see, is front and central in terms of the way that we think about how a system should interpret FHIR resources, but it's not super widely understood. So let me just give you my quick take about what this modifier concept even means in the first place and why we're calling it out here in the FHIR specification. And there's some kinds of deep data modeling points that are worth raising here. Let's just take a look at something like the immunization resource. It's one I've been thinking about quite a bit as I've been doing some work relating to COVID-19 immunization records. And an immunization resource captures details about a vaccine somebody may have received, including information about who received that vaccine, the encounter, if any, when the vaccine was given, information about specifically what time, the date on which the vaccine was given, who recorded it, where it was given, what product, all these kinds of details that you might expect would occur in a vaccination record. And if we look at what's going on in this column of the definitions here, we see there's certain flags that are defined. And the source of truth, if you want to learn about these flags, you can get to if you click on the word flags here. And there's a table that describes exactly what all these things mean, including specifically this guide to a set of flags, which can look sort of cryptic. And honestly, they can be easy to miss when you're reviewing this for the first time. But there's all these symbols that we should take a look at. And the one that we're going to focus on right now is the idea that an element is a modifying element. So this is this sort of interrobang, question mark, exclamation point flag. What is this all about? It's maybe easy to understand from an example. So an immunization has a status. And this is super important because if I say that I'm putting together a record for a COVID-19 vaccination, the status might say that the vaccination was completed or that the vaccination was not done. And these are two very different kinds of records that I might represent, one saying that it was done and one that it wasn't done. And if you ignore this status flag as an application that's looking through an immunization record, if you just fail to pay attention to this, you might actually mistreat a record saying that the immunization was not given. if you ignore it by default, you might think the reason there's an immunization here is because immunization was given. But the truth is, that's not a safe thing to do in FHIR. You need to pay attention to these modifier elements because they don't just provide a little bit of extra detail the way that other elements do. Modifier elements are capable of really changing the meaning of a resource. And you might think this could be a little bit of a gray area, and there probably are some cases where it's not crystal clear if an element is a modifier or not. But in general, the assessment that you should do is, for each of these elements, the way that we decide whether it's a modifier or not is to figure out whether the meaning of the resource changes significantly, whether the resource's interpretation could be completely different based on this flag. And so a not done flag is a clear example here, versus something like the recorded time, which is information about when the vaccination was recorded. Well, it's nice to know. It might be very helpful to understand the particular date and time in which this record was first recorded. But if I don't know that information, it doesn't fundamentally change the meaning of everything else. That's the idea of a modifier element. Okay. With that intuition about modifier elements, you're probably in a good position to read the FHIR documentation in the conformance rules section, going into specifically when a field or an element is going to be labeled as is modifier. So I'll point that out as the source of truth for this information if you want to dig in more deeply. The last thing that I wanted to talk about today then was the concept of a modifier extension. And if you're familiar with FHIR extensibility model, you will know that it's possible to add extensions to pretty much everything in FHIR. You can add extensions to basically any resource or any piece of data within a resource. And in general, the idea of these extensions is they can provide extra information that may be useful for implementers. So if we look at the patient resource, for example, we can even see some extensions that are defined as part of the core FHIR spec. They're not built into the patient resource, but these extensions are defined right here in the FHIR spec so that if you have one of these common needs, you don't have to go and invent your own extension for it. So a great example is the patient birth time extension. So in the core FHIR spec, every patient has a birth date, which is at the level of a day and a year, but not using the date time data type. And the reason for that is simply this is how most real-world systems are designed, and FHIR is expected to track real-world system capabilities. Most systems don't support time-level details, but it can be an important thing to say, particularly when you're working with newborns and you need to calculate time of life at the level of minutes or hours and not just days. So there's a standard extension that allows you to provide a patient's birth time in addition to their birth date. You can see there's lots of standard extensions that tell you things about a patient's nationality or religion or citizenship or whether they want to be subscribed as a cadaveric donor. All these are extensions because they provide extra detail about a patient that doesn't belong in the core FHIR data model. But let's see if there's any modifier extensions. And the answer is no, there's not. What would a modifier extension even be? Well, first thing to say about a modifier extension in FHIR is that it shows up differently in a resource. So in the core FHIR spec, when you're dealing with an extension, you'll see the word extension in the JSON serialization. So for example, if I look at the FHIR US core specification and look at one of the example patients here in US core, let's just open up one of the examples. Let's deal with a patient. And let's take a look at the JSON representation of this patient. And we can see right here in the JSON body, there's an array of extensions. Oops, clicked too many times. There's an array of extensions on the patient that includes things like Office of Management and Budget categories, OMB categories for race and ethnicity, as well as information about a patient's birth sex. So that's an example of an extension. And it's serialized using the word extension. Now, why am I harping on this? Because it's also possible to provide modifier extensions, and those will show up with the word modifier extension here instead of the word extension. And the idea of a modifier extension is something that can fundamentally change the meaning of the data, like what we looked at with the immunization record. And a modifier extension needs to be documented in a particular way using a special keyword of modifier extension rather than just the bare keyword of extension. And the reason for this is it's very important to pay attention to modifier extensions when they're present. If you ignore them, you're very likely to be misinterpreting the data and drawing incorrect conclusions about what those data mean. And so part of the job of any system working with FHIR data is to, if it's receiving data from the outside in a FHIR format, to look through that data payload and find any modifier extensions that might be present anywhere inside of the resource. If you find modifier extensions and you don't know what they mean, if you're not familiar, for example, with what it means to have this example of a fake sort of anti-prescription modifier extension, then as soon as you see this modifier extension and JSON payload, and you see a URL that you don't recognize here, the expectation is you should not process this resource as normal. You should route it to some sort of exception queue, bring it to a human's attention for review, maybe reject an instance if it's being posted in some sort of automatic API in your service. So there's a whole set of suggestions here about how you might want to deal with this. But the important thing is, as a developer working with FHIR, you be aware of the fact that modifier extensions exist and that modifier elements exist so that you can design your software to handle these things appropriately. I will say that modifier extensions don't come up too often in practice because they raise such important and challenging obligations for implementers to meet. It can be a pretty tricky thing to deal with these correctly. So mostly as a matter of practice, we don't see these too often, but it's high on the safety checklist because if you do get a modifier extension, it's something you really want to deal with correctly. So that's a quick introduction to the fact that the safety checklist in FHIR exists. We've done a tour through sort of items number 2 and number 3. And if there's interest, we can do a deep dive in other topics from the safety checklist to figure out what they mean. It's a good way to test your understanding of many of the subtler aspects of the FHIR spec. So that's it for the session today. Hope you found this interesting, and please let me know if there's more that you'd like to see in terms of detail here.